Orderly exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Today is an international day for innocent children who are victims of aggression. The essence of a day like this is to draw attention to these kind of aggression that they go through, the kind of emotional, physical, and intellectual abuse that they are being subjected to, and the need for this to be eradicated globally. This is going to be the thrust of our conversation now, and joining us is Noya Sedi, who is the program officer for global rights. He's also a lawyer, gender equality, social inclusion advocate. Glad to have you join us this morning, Noya.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right. On a day like this, it's important we paint a picture of these innocent children who are being subjected to aggression globally. Now, give us a picture of how bad the situation is globally, and what are the factors responsible for this kind of aggression. When you talk about physical, emotional abuse, these children are being subjected to.
Okay, so I think it's a very layered question because the nature of abuse that children endure is both direct and indirect. So when we talk about it from the perspective of child abuse, say physical abuse, emotional abuse that they deal with at home or in school, that is one layer of it. And then there's another aspect of it which deals with the, in situations where there will be violence, insecurity, or conflict, where the parents of those children are affected, and how that indirectly affects them, and also how they are direct victims of incidences of violence and insecurity challenges across the country. So it's a cuts across all sectors. So there's no issue that you would say affects the general Nigerian populace that doesn't affect children. And what makes it more dire is because children already are a vulnerable group. They are young, they are minors in the legal sense. So they are young and they're minors in the legal sense, and because of that, they're a vulnerable group. They're often marginalized, and it is already the duty of the state, duty of the community, duty of the family and world around them to look after and to protect children. So when they are in a system that has failed them, they are more exposed to other forms of violence. So, for example, when you see children who are engaged in, say, begging on the streets or hawking, they are more susceptible, they are more vulnerable when they're on the streets because they're children. They're more susceptible to abuse, to sexual violence, rape. So any kind of abuse that you can think of that affects the average Nigerian person affects children disproportionately.
What is the implication of a day like this on conflict areas, particularly as we have conflict ongoing in places like Ukraine and Gaza?
Okay, so we see what is happening even outside Nigeria, where children are still the ones who are bearing the brunt of violence. So whether it's through the mothers who are carrying them, whether it's the fathers who they've lost, whether it's family members who are looking after them, who have been killed, and then they're the only ones left to fend for themselves, and then bringing it home to Nigeria, we see situations where not too long ago in Kaduna State, 287 children were kidnapped from school. And this is something that has been happening since over the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, we have had over 2,000 children adopted in Nigeria. So it is a day where we sit down and really think and just take a moment and understand how the various forms of violence that exist in our society are affecting children disproportionately, not just in Nigeria, but everywhere around the world. Children are to be protected, are to be nurtured, are to be preserved by the community. It is a general responsibility of the government and the people around them to protect them. And then it is not just a time for us to acknowledge their suffering, but a moment for us to demand accountability. For us to remember and for us to demand accountability for these children.
All right. According to the United Nations, over 8,000 children were being killed in 2021 alone as a result of the use of explosives during war. And this also accounts for the 25% of deaths being recorded as regards children. What do you think is responsible for this trend? And then what happens to this convention when it comes to war, where children are being respected or the rights of children are being respected? How bad it is?
Okay, so I think bringing it to Nigeria now, You see, when you talk about conventions and talk about treaties, Nigeria is signatory to a lot of treaties. For example, even the Child Rights Act that we have now is based on the protection of the child treaty from the 80s. And this is something that we have, as of today, the Child Rights Act has been adopted across all the states in Nigeria. So this is something, and this is the act it is a federal law, and every state has then adopted it as state law, which is there to safeguard and to protect our children. Now, one trend that I think, especially in the Nigerian context, that I think I have observed is that we don't seem to have a specific strategy or a specific program dedicated to protecting children who are victims of violence. So whether it's war, whether it's insecurity, whether it's insurgency across the country, when we talk about aggression against children, the idea that a lot of people would have would be issues around child abuse and domestic violence and physical abuse and maybe bullying, which is of course also a problem. But then when we talk about violence and we talk about the numbers of people who are being killed every day, the number you mentioned when you said 8,000, a large number of that includes children. But then we don't have any mainstreamed or inclusive strategies that have been deployed to cater to these children, to cater to children who are the indirect victims and children who have been affected because maybe members of their families have been affected. So I think that is one thing that we need to stop and think of and say, how are we protecting our children here in the country? In Nigeria, before we even start thinking about global perspective and how all of these conventions that we have and all these treaties that we have signed, how they affect us, the laws that we have domesticated locally in our country, how well are they being implemented and how cost-crossing are they? How do they cater to the average child who is a victim of violence, who is a victim of mass atrocities in Nigeria? So I think that is where the question starts from.
All right, starting the question from there, how are we protecting them? Some of these children are already exposed to violence, particularly those who've been in conflict area. Let's come back to Nigeria. The northern part of Nigeria, we know that some part of it have been ravaged by activities of the Boko Haram insurgents. And then we also have children who are in the internally displaced camps. They've been there for several years. What should be the way to recovery, the way to attend to children like this who've had one psychological trauma or the other? Some have seen their parents slain before them.
So yes, which brings me to my earlier point about a proper rehabilitation strategy. When I think of rehabilitation, I think about the 3 Ps. I think about prevention. I think about protection. And I think about prosecution. Now, when it comes to children, because they are a very vulnerable group, it is very important to it's never a one-size-fits-all approach. Rehabilitating children is different from how you rehabilitate a woman or how you rehabilitate an elderly person or a person with a disability. And that is what I think we're lacking. It's just a structure I think we're lacking in Nigeria. We are very quick to rehabilitate perpetrators of crimes and reintegrate them into society. We hear a lot of programs that say, oh, he's an ex-Boko Haram and they're trying to reintegrate him into society, which is fine. But at the same time, what happens to those victims? What happens to the people who that particular individual has violated? What is the plan? Because it's that same society that the person violated. We are reintegrating somebody back into the society that they have violated. So what of the people that they left and people that are coming back to meet? What are the strategies to ensure that the reception, to control the reception of those people? So while I feel like the government should not feel like their job alone stops at rehabilitating criminals, in quotes, but also the victims and the survivors of those crimes. Because at the end of the day, when you see your survivor and you're confronted and you're living in the same society as your abuser or as the person who perpetrated your crime, that is when you start to have this cycle of abuse, this cycle of violence, this cycle of there's a retaliation spirit that rises in you, especially when nothing has been done on your end. So if I have been violated and then the person who violated me, I'm seeing that he's being reintegrated in society and has to come back to that society which he violated, I get angry. And that anger is what is then used as well. And then sometimes you see children, young people, they take up arms. The young children are now being used as weapons. They're being weaponized because they're young, they're easy to brainwash. And then when you see somebody whose parents have been killed and who has a lot of anger bottled up inside of them, and then they see that the person who perpetrated this attack is being reintegrated and rehabilitated into society, that anger can then be weaponized. That anger serves as fuel for them to continue that cycle of violence, for them to continue that cycle of, abuse, for them to continue that cycle of taking up arms. They feel justified in their own rights. So I think there has to be a balance wherein while we're trying to integrate perpetrators into society, while we're trying to integrate former criminals into society, there needs to be a rehabilitation program for the people who have been violated, and they need to be targeted. How they affect women, how they affect older people, how they affect children is so different. We hear stories of people who were the Chibok girls who were abducted in 2014. Some of them have gone back to school now. Some of out of those girls, 90 are still unaccounted for. Of those who have been released, some of them have gone back to school, and we see that they are struggling now to reintegrate to society. They are being discriminated against, they are being bullied, and there's nothing in place. They tell you that they do therapy, but there isn't a structured program in place to ensure their seamless transition. Rather, you hear stories and you hear things like, oh, they have decided to marry the person that kidnapped them. They want to marry their abductors. We are now seeing what is supposed to be Stockholm syndrome, what is supposed to be a problem. We're now normalizing it and saying, oh yes, they are marrying the person. Yes, let them stay married, and we're supporting this marriage. And they're young, but it's better for us to marry the adult. Things like that. All of that is psychological. All of that is mental. All of that is emotional, and nothing is being done. About all of these things. And these are children who have been directly affected by this conflict. So I think it's a balanced approach. I think it starts with, education. It starts with awareness creation, and it starts with an actual structured system of rehabilitation and reintegration, not just for the accused or for the perpetrator, but for the survivors as well, for the victims as well. And it has to be disaggregated. There has to be mainstreaming, such that there are targeted programs for children, for women, and for different classes of people, because they are affected differently.
All right, let's look at this trend in Africa, the issue of child labor. Also, we look at the out-of-school children. Now, if you look at this trend, it's very peculiar in Africa. What do you think is likely fueling this development, and how do we take advantage of a day like this to draw attention to this and to us tackling these problems?
So Nigeria has the highest number of out-of-school children in the world, and it is a dazzling statistic. It is a very sad reality. And there's so many factors that contribute to this: religious factors, traditional factors, geographical factors, and insecurity challenges. Like I said, when we talk about conflict, we're very quick to talk about how people are killed every day and how the country is unsafe, which is true. But there's so many layers to it and how it affects so many sectors of the country, like education. Now, I mentioned about 2,000 children have been abducted since the first major landmark kidnapping in 2014. Not too long ago, 287 students were abducted from school in Kaduna State, Kaduna local government. This is something that has now become a trend. This is something that has become a pattern. Schools are no longer safe. The Safe School initiative that was initiated in 2014 the financing plan was only released in 2022. When the NSCDC conducted the survey, we found out that out of the 81,000 schools, that were deemed porous in terms of security, that survey was only conducted on 21,000 schools. So a lot of schools are still left out of this plan. And out of the 21,000 schools, a lot of schools were still deemed porous. What am I saying? Schools are not safe. Schools are not safe for Nigerians. For the average Nigerian community, schools are no longer safe. People are, especially when you move up north, people are more willing to marry off their daughters than to send them to school because they feel like schools are no longer safe. Schools are no longer safe for them in the school premises. People are no longer feel safe to make those walks or to send their daughters to walk along the road to school because anything can happen on the way because of insecurity. So insecurity is affecting education. We already have a high number of out-of-school children, and insecurity is contributing to that number. Because the schools are not safe, the roads to the schools are not safe, the school structure is not safe for children. People are hesitant to go to school, people are hesitant to send their children to school. So on a day like this, we need to raise awareness, not just on education, but on the underlying problems. We need to talk about how traditional factors, how religious factors, and how insecurity are strong players, are strong factors that contribute to this number that we have today. And we need to start to develop strategies, to tackle this problem. We need to start to develop strategies to understand how how one issue affects the other, how it's a domino effect, and how we can start to tackle this problem from the roots.
All right, finally, let's take a look at the economic challenges that sometimes expose children. Some parents would willingly give their children to people who would offer to, in quotes, give them a better life, only for the children to be exploited. And in some cases, the children are being violated, and even they suffer violence from these supposed guardians that are supposed to give them a better life. Now, what should be the system? I know there are laws that ensures the protection of children, but in reality, implementation of these laws, we also have in various states the Ministry of Women Affairs that is also sometimes responsible for protecting the welfare of children. What should be done to ensure protection of these children? Some of them cannot cry out. Some of them, neighbors have helped them cry out.
Okay. I'm sorry. I think my power just went out, so I'm just. I don't know if you can hear me still.
I can hear you clearly.
Okay. It will be back soon. Okay. So I think for children, first of all, Child's Rights Act clearly prohibits child labor. So a lot of people who are a lot of children who are working in quotes are doing so illegally. That is not supposed to be the case. There are specific age restrictions according to the Child's Rights Act, which states what kind of work a child at a particular age should do. So full child labor and all of these things that you mentioned are illegal. However, like you said, in practice, it's a completely different story. So what the law says is different from what happens in practice. But I think that when we have a system which actually, protects our children, it makes all these things easier. Nigeria doesn't have a deficiency of laws. We have a lot of laws. The Ministry of Justice in Lagos, they have a child protection and safeguarding policy, to protect children against issues like this. Public institutions, private institutions, schools, and the world around them are responsible for the child according to that policy. And it's supposed to be an all hands on deck policy. And I think the general idea, the general lack of implementation, the general lack of that lacklusterness of culture in Nigeria contributes to this. So a lot of times, poverty, for example, is a major factor in why we see a lot of children actually doing odd jobs, because the parents want a better life. We see children on the streets hawking or begging for money, begging for alms for their families or for themselves, and all of that. That is a major challenge, and that is a major problem. And like I said, lots of times the underlying problem is poverty. However, on a day like this, it's important to raise awareness on these issues. But we need to raise awareness on the issues on implementation of these laws, so that people can actually know that these things that are being done are illegal, and there are systems for redress. There are systems wherein a child can actually be taken from the parents if the parents are abusing the child, if the parents are subjecting that child to child labor, if the parents are exploiting that child. Now, like I said, poverty exists, but it's not an excuse for child labor. Children are innocent and they should be protected. And once you have a society that sees children as vulnerable and actually strives to protect them, we'll continue to have this problem. We need to start to establish child protection policies, not just outside the Child's Rights Act. Child protection policies at the state level is so important to guide how children are being protected and safeguarded in the community, not just on paper, but also in the implementation of those policies as well.
All right, let's wrap up with these. What would be your advice for innocent children who are victims of aggression globally, and advice to parents or guardians who are in custody of these children, knowing fully well that some of them, they might not be able to enforce their rights?
Honestly, it's difficult to advise children who are victims of aggression because they're children and there's little that they can do to remove themselves from that state of victimhood. The general, the brunt of it lies on the adults in their lives and the people responsible for them, and of course the government. The government is not solely, but is largely responsible for the welfare of the child in the states. So parents need to ensure that the children are protected. They need to ensure that the rights of their children are preserved. They need to educate themselves. The public, when we start to see children as people, who require a communal effort to protect and to preserve. I think we'll start to understand the responsibility that lies on each of our shoulders. So the children cannot really do anything about it. It's everybody else around them. So like the media, for example, can raise awareness on these issues. The media can talk about these things. They can tell these stories. They can advocate. They can hold the government accountable. The government can also start to, in plain terms, just start to take children more seriously. And there are lots of schemes, there are lots of programs that are put in place by governors and governors' wives. But how many of those programs are effective? How many of those programs actually outlived the term of the sitting governor at the time? You know, it is important that children are prioritized in policy making, in when all these strategies are being deployed. It's important that children are prioritized in terms of relief, in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of protection, in terms of safeguarding. It is when it comes to the social sector, schools as well. Every single institution, every single sector in the country needs to see children as their responsibility. Needs to start to ensure that protection and preservation laws for children exist within their own. If the government doesn't want to implement a law, if the government is not serious about implementing policies, then in our own way, let's implement our own policies. Let's have our own values and rules that guide us personally, in our workplaces, in our schools, in public spaces. Let's ensure that we owe it to those children to protect and to preserve them. If you see a child being violated, if you see a child being abused, it is your responsibility to speak out. You don't have to say, oh, it's not my business. I don't have any business with the child. It's not my child. It is a collective responsibility. A lot of these children cannot speak for themselves, which is why it's difficult to advise them. So it is the responsibility of the world around them to protect them. They are looking up to us, to ensure that we protect them, we provide for them, and we safeguard their rights. A lot of the cries that are being made now about this Israel and Palestine war are because of the children, the innocent children who are being wrongfully violated. These children cannot speak. Some are babies. Some are still in the wombs of their mothers. Some are, a lot of the world is crying out on their behalf, and that is what we should do. That is how we should see these things. Children are our responsibility, and it's our job to cry out on their behalf.
Thank you very much, Noya Sedi. We've been talking with Noya Sedi, who has been looking with us at the issue concerning children who are victims, innocent children who are victims of aggression, not just in Nigeria, but all over the world. And from what she said, it's a responsibility of everyone to ensure that we protect the rights of children. We thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.